Okay, thank you so much to Printed Matter and Max Schumann for including us in the Friendly Fire section of the virtual art book fair. So weird not to be next to our usual table neighbors and instead be in our basements and offices. My name is Marc Fischer from the group Temporary Services, here with...
Yeah, I'm Brett Bloom. I'm also part of Temporary Services. Marc and I have been working together since 1998, and we're going to talk about Prisoners Inventions for a few minutes. This project was...
yeah.
Oh, yeah, go ahead, hold it
up. Yeah, a book that we would have been extremely excited to share in person. At every book fair, people ask, when are you going to reprint that thing?
Yeah, I think it has been at every single book fair, Printed Matter book fair, and other book fairs. We've been asked about this book when we're finally getting off our butts and getting it back on the shelves. So after 15 years.
Through our publishing imprint, Half Letter Press. And we're joined by Mariame Kaba, past collaborator. The greatest thing about working with Mariame for this presentation is that it won't require us to go to the post office to mail thousands of copies of our publication.
Oh my gosh, she's kept us busier than anybody. Well, I say us, Marc. She's kept Marc at the post office more than anybody else we've worked with. So
yeah,
we owe her a belated thank you.
Our Prisoners Inventions collaborator, Angelo.
Yes.
So Mariame Kaba is an organizer, educator, and curator who's active in movements for racial, gender, and transformative justice. She's the founder and director of Project Naya, or is it Project Nia? I'm so tired.
Project Nia. It's okay.
Project Nia, a grassroots abolitionist organization with a vision to end youth incarceration. Mariame is currently a researcher at Interrupting Criminalization Research in Action at the Bernard Center for Research on Women, a project she co-founded with Andrea Ritchie in 2018. Mariame has co-founded multiple other organizations and projects over the years, including We Charge Genocide, the Chicago Freedom School, the Chicago Task Force on Violence Against Girls and Young Women, Love and Protect, the Just Practice Collaborative, and Survived and Punished. She's going to be talking today about her forthcoming book, which will be out right about when this is broadcast, right before, called We Do This Till We Free Us, Abolitionist Organizing and Transformative Justice, that will be published by Haymarket Books on February 23rd. Mariame's leadership, organizing, and influence extend widely as she offers a radical analysis that influences how people think and respond to how violence, prisons, and policing affect the lives of people of color. So Brett and I will present first as quickly as we can, and then we'll let Mariame take over, and then we'll leave some time for the three of us to speak afterward. So we're just going to focus on this book, Prisoners Inventions, which was written by our late collaborator, Angelo. It was first published in 2003. Back then, Salem Kolo-Julian was also a member of the group and was instrumental in this project coming to fruition. And the book was produced in collaboration with our late friend Angelo, who was incarcerated in California at the time. It was originally published by White Walls, and it's been out of print for a very long time and has since been reprinted by us last month. So I'm going to share screen, and then maybe Brett, if you want to take it away and start. Can you see the presentation okay?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. I see the title page. Yeah, so we printed the book this year with 80 plus pages of material that Angelo had created after the first publishing. He'd actually sent us an additional 100, he said, maybe, or he had 100 other pages that were either confiscated. I think they were confiscated from his cell. So it's quite amazing that this book, in either form, the first version or the second one, exists, because we did not ask for permission from the prison to engage in this collaboration. It was all based on correspondence that had pre-existed. That was happening before temporary services existed. Marc had correspondence with Angelo before we were a group. And we solicited this information from Angelo. He sent us packets for safekeeping, and the book got started quite by accident. I think we made an exhibition of Angelo's drawings at a exhibition space we had in the center of Chicago, and it started a dialogue through the letters Marc was writing to Angelo at that time. And Angelo happened to mention these inventions that people would make to sort of cope with the harsh realities, the dehumanizing, degrading realities of prisons in the United States. Simple inventions that weren't kind of they weren't what you'd expect. You'd expect what you hear about in popular media: weapons, ways of hurting other people. These were more simple, more banal. They're about everyday comforts and needs, things that maybe folks missed or could not have access to while they were in prison. We saw this material and were quite overwhelmed by the creativity, the humanity, the sort of quiet dignity in the production of this kind of activity.
So this is an example of the kind of artwork Angelo was doing before this project. I mean, and like throughout his entire life, the kind of work that we had exhibited before collaborating with him on Prisoners Inventions. Angelo could basically draw anything that he had observed. Most of the inventions that he described in the book were not things that he made, but things that he had seen various cellmates over the years or other prisoners had created. And a kind of aspect of temporary services work in general is that we don't observe a meaningful distinction between the kind of creativity that goes into inventing something with limited resources and other forms of artwork. It's also just kind of, I think, a testimony to the power of zines and self-publishing, that the way I originally came into contact with Angelo was when I was in college, when a cellmate of his requested a zine that I published, just like a small photocopied zine about underground music and art and politics. And his cellmate shared the zine with Angelo, who then wrote to me. And the entirety of our work on Prisoners Inventions was through the mail, through postal correspondence. We never even spoke on the phone the entire time. It was just the nature of the relationship that had happened through many, many letters back and forth, and the kind of trust that emerges, from so many years of writing. And when temporary services started, we started sending him the booklets and zine-like publications that temporary services made, and that was his introduction to the work Brett Salem and I and other earlier collaborators were doing together. So this is a drawing more like as we would receive it. All of the pages in the book were drawn to scale, pretty much to scale, the way that they're published. And this is a drawing of, oh yeah, go ahead, Brett.
No, I was just moving in my seat. Those who picked it up. You go ahead. You take it, Marc.
So this was one of many variations of a cigarette lighter that was made using D-cell batteries, a couple pieces of stray wire, and a piece of a heating element that might have come from a immersion heater or a hairdryer or something like that. There was a lot of discussion in the book around smoking, which at the time was legal outside but not inside the cell block, but a lot of guards would kind of turn the other cheek because they were smokers themselves and understood how difficult that would be. Later, smoking was outlawed throughout all of California prisons. But as Angelo was sending us this material, we also talked about how it might become an exhibit. And we all of these things are contraband to have, right? Everything that Angelo illustrated is contraband. So he couldn't just get us one of these things and send it to us. But he liked the idea of us following his drawings and making our own versions to exhibit alongside his writings and drawings. So so that was a way that we proceeded with.
Yeah, you
creating
could
the exhibit.
you can maybe light three to five cigarettes with this construction. And that was the amazing thing is that, well, first of all, if we were able to make the things that Angelo drew and described, we had to put this all in perspective. Some of the things that are represented in the book, folks took 6 months of scavenging, of swiping, of thinking through ways of doing and solving really simple things with real scarcity. Took this enormous amount of time to figure stuff out. We could just buy materials at the Walgreens down the street and cobble these things together fairly quickly. That was privilege and luxuries we had in realizing this project, but the things really did work, like the cigarette lighter. It was frightening sometimes if you didn't follow the instructions really closely, because things would kind of explode in your face, like the cigarette lighters. You had to be very careful.
So the rest of, I think, the presentation, these are pages as they're presented in the book, which we should say was designed very wonderfully by Partner and Partners based in New York. Really great collaboration. There have been so many layers of collaboration in this project. And a lot of, the inventions are not particularly Rube Goldberg-like or something. Like, this is just a way of manipulating blankets and pillows and towels and your mattress to create an additional writing surface. I think through almost all of Angelo's incarceration, he had a cellmate, and there would only be one writing desk per cell for 2 people. So he was constantly rearranging things to create work surfaces. There are a lot of pages devoted to techniques for cooking food or trying to improve the state-issued food by heating it, in this case on a cell light fixture. And then Angelo details some of the ways he made something kind of like a pizza by dehydrating bread on a light fixture, letting it get stale to the point that it tastes crunchy, without obviously being able to bake it in an oven.
Probably not much better than gluten-free pizza that I eat these days. I imagine it's very similar. So these are some of the inventions that are quite frightening to actually make and employ. Ways of heating water if your prison didn't let you have a hot pot to heat your water. So the one on the right is one that was really pleasurable to make. You melt together old toothbrushes, and then you take paperclip binders and you rubber band them together onto this structure you've melted together, and then you plug it into the wall, and it actually does boil the water. It takes quite some time, and you're left with very brown water. You should maybe make coffee with this. So it kind of masks the corrosion of the paperclip binder. So these were some of the conditions that weren't described, but we found out pretty quickly what it means to use a tool like this.
And it was a way to, to boil water for things like making cup of noodles, tea, coffee, any kind of cooking situation that might require boiling soup or something like that. This was also another technique that involved re-rolling toilet paper and using it to heat metal surfaces from below, to make like toasted sandwiches and things like that.
A lot of the inventions like this come with warnings. This one will produce a lot of smoke, blister the paint on your furniture, etc. And throughout the book, and it was nice returning to this book and editing it again, was to find Angelo's intelligence, his warmth, his humor, and this really careful attention to all these details throughout, whether it's in the drawings or whether it's in the descriptions or whether it's in the narratives of recounting these things to share with us, as if, we're gonna make these things at home. There's a funny kind of disconnect, I think, that happens when reading this. That's also quite enjoyable.
Yeah, I think it's like kind of awkward for people because I mean he's living in such incredibly dehumanizing circumstances. I mean, he was constantly having things stolen by guards, constantly having his cell turned upside down, searching for who knows what during these completely surprising cell searches. Lost enormous amounts of artwork, but still, I think, was able to find humor in the imagination of the people that he shared his experience with and shared prison with. It took him a long time after we invited him to maybe illustrate some of these things to be able to imagine why this would be interesting to someone, because it was so commonplace and normal for him to encounter people doing things like this. These are more elaborate ways of lighting cigarettes, lots of things involving, shoving paper clips and bits of metal into electrical outlets. We would try making these and, like the lights would start dimming and the apartment.
Or this one, if you put the radio resistor on the wrong side, it would blow up.
Yeah,
Not an
just like
explosion, but it would
details,
just flare. It would just flare up. The heating element would, light on fire.
Some of the more recent editions in the new printing of the book were multiple ways of getting electricity to several appliances with just two outlets, because of having a cellmate who, if someone wants to listen to the radio with earphones and use an electric razor while your cellmate watches TV, and you have two jacks, you can do things like this or like that. And the other component of the book and of the project, because the project also, took this exhibition form, was that it was Angelo's idea to include a mock-up of like a model of his prison cell. And originally he was thinking that this would be some kind of like a small cardboard construction. And then we sent him a publication from an exhibit by friends of ours, Zena Sikowski and Rob Kelly. And Angelo saw that they were able to build complicated things. And then he started thinking that maybe it could be a full-size prison cell. And his interest was that as part of guards training, they would have to spend a certain amount of time inside a cell to get like a more physical and psychological sense of something of what that experience might be like.
Yep.
Angelo started detailing everything.
Yeah, we had talked about the prison cell too, as really giving you this intense psychological access to the conditions, just giving you a glimpse of the conditions under which these inventions are made. And a lot of that comes through in the book, but unless you've been in prison, you don't understand like how demoralizing, degrading, humiliating, infantilizing, and oppressive it is on a moment-to-moment basis. Like depending on the activity of the day, you have very little control over how you dress yourself, when you eat, when you go to the restroom, how loudly you talk. You're constantly yelled at. All these things that just sort of pile on this lack of agency and this lack of humanity. It's hard to give that full context with this exhibition, but it gets at it. It brings people, I think it pulls people into a strong sense of what that could be like, just given what these things are dealing with and the creativity and the cell. I remember walking into the very first version of the recreation and just losing my breath at how incredibly small it was. And, just imagining spending a weekend with Marc locked in here and just how claustrophobic it would be. We've collaborated a long time, but that might have killed it.
Might have, or a lot of new ideas. Yeah, so this was how the recreated cell looked when it was first made. by fabricators at Mass Mocha. And it was such an interesting process, I think, for everyone working together on this with, Angelo was still incarcerated at the time. There was a lot of concern and distrust at the museum, not knowing why Angelo was in prison, not necessarily feeling the need to know that, but also thinking I think the fabricators were thinking a lot about, like, we're carrying out these plans by this person we've never met, and it was a normal part of their work that they would fabricate very elaborate things for artists for their exhibits. And a lot of times artists would make these just really shoddy, vague drawings of what they expected the fabricators to do that didn't respect their, like, didn't really take into account like how much was left out. And so these fabricators were kind of, think, not feeling great about doing this until they received these blueprint drawings like the ones we just showed. And then they were sort of like, oh, this is our guy. Like, this guy took everything into consideration. And they, suddenly got really excited about working on this. One anecdote we always tell is that after we sent Angelo pictures of the installation, a guard did find these photos like this of his prison cell and got really furious and asked Angelo, how the hell did you get photos of your cell? Thinking in like the pre-digital camera years in 2003 that he had somehow, got it somehow, like someone smuggled in a camera and took photos, and he got the film processed and sent back to him. And then Angelo pointed out all of the discrepancies in how it was executed, and the fact that there's no window because it would have been strange to have a window looking out across other parts of the museum or something. And the guard found that really amusing. But every kind of part of this was some kind of was a really interesting negotiation and an attempt to make Angelo feel as included as possible, given that we were still doing everything through the mail, and obviously he was not going to be able to travel. So making it clear to audiences and institutions that he was an equal collaborator, that we were not just using some random prisoner's ideas and thinking and work, but that he was like an additional member of our group for the extent of time that we were working on that project with him.
Yeah, that was certainly one of the accusations we received, was that we were just taking this work from other people and making it our own work without really giving credit to the people involved. And maybe this criticism came in part because there was only the name Angelo appended to this work. There wasn't a name where you could actually find out what his full name was, where he was, why he was incarcerated, all these things. We actually ended up having quite an intense back and forth with Mass Mocha over the identity of Angelo and what he may or may not have done, and almost canceled the exhibition. This was our first museum exhibition, or major museum exhibition, and we weren't even convinced in the first place that we should be dealing with a museum, just given all the constraints that they want to put on things and the way that they tend to kill vibrant ideas, like this one we're working on, where some people weren't even willing to see it as an artwork. So we insisted, or actually we came to this place where we would just use Angelo's artist name, and it was his choice. We were insisting on using his name because we thought it was the thing that he wanted us to do, to give him full credit, so people would have to see his name there alongside ours as a collaborator. We found a long time ago we had to do this when listing everybody who was a part of the group and the collaborators in a project, because we're often confronted with external racism and sexism about how our group might work without any kind of knowledge of the insistence on really working through things, discussing things, working through problems, confronting things like these issues within our process. So Angelo just sort of solved the problem himself by deciding to use his name. Then nobody would have access to to performing this sort of like this crazy ritual of, well, if he did this, that's acceptable and we can have this exhibition. But if he did these things, then he's no longer human. And we refuse to see this work as meaningful contribution to our understanding of our culture and our world. So this is something we're going to talk a little bit more with Mariame about when we're done.
Yeah, it was ultimately, I mean,
Inventions.
yeah, Angelo is how he signs all of his drawings. It's his, you know, he was, I think a lot of people maybe thought he was our age. He was actually probably about 20 years older than us at the time. I think we all loved like the multi-generational aspect of the collaboration, but he was, you know, he was like thinking of probably people like Calder and Miro and Picasso, but like an artist should have a single name, or Prince. And so it was really his decision. And you know, at the time we had no idea why he was in prison. It wasn't a foundational part of why we worked with him. And the project is really about experiences that millions of people in prison have had, including people in other countries. We would travel. We went to the, Salem and I at the time went to the museum at Buchenwald, and, you know, saw extremely similar things from decades earlier that, you know, were just like things Angelo had illustrated. People in other countries, you know, would constantly point out things that, or we read a book, I think, about prison in Thailand and found descriptions of things that were identical to what Angelo drew.
Or more horrific.
Yeah.
But in the research we did, so we haven't described fully how you would encounter prisoners' inventions in an exhibition setting. You would see multiple inventions, you'd see the drawings. We made some videos of how these things function. You'd see this prison cell, and what Marc is getting to a little bit is that we made a library trying to collect information around a variety of things related to this work. And we found movies, prisoners' inventions in movies across cultures. We found prisoners' inventions in literature and in examples from all over the place. I also had the opportunity to visit Buchenwald and saw prisoners' inventions on display there. So yeah, it's this kind of thing that when people are like put in such horrific conditions of deprivation, that creativity can often be this way to help folks survive or cope with this degrading experience.
Maybe just the last thing to add before we hand it over to Mariame. So Angelo was released from prison in 2014. We were able to actually finally give him a copy of the first printing of his book, which he was never able to receive while he was incarcerated, because it shows things that he was not allowed to have, which is just completely absurd, that everything would be able to come out of the prison but not go back in book form. And sadly, Angelo passed away in late December of 2016. Kind of amazingly, the last time I saw him was he briefly stopped by the LA Art Book Fair in earlier in 2016 and was totally overwhelmed by all the books and all of the people. I think that was kind of a little bit too much, as it is for most normal people. It's a completely claustrophobic environment, but it's a real honor to be able to re-release this. So we will shut up for a bit and hand it over to Mariame. And Mariame, do you want to share your presentation, or would you like me to?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, I will share that.
And let me make sure that sharing is enabled. Yes.
Great. Well, thank you both for inviting me to do this with you. I'm so happy to do that. I really so appreciate Prisoners Inventions as a book, but I appreciate it more as kind of an artifact of a relationship that was built over decades. That is really what this kind of book encapsulates. Both like the fact that Marc, you had mentioned to me earlier that, you know, you and Angelo never talked on the phone. You always corresponded with each other through the mail. That, you know, just the idea that he would be basically smuggling these drawings and these papers out of the prison to you, this form of resistance, this form of a refusal to be completely dehumanized and controlled by basically a coercive institution, violent, harmful. I just find it wonderful. So again, thank you for having me and allowing me to join you. And I thought when you invited me that what I wanted to do was to speak to the moment that we're currently in, which is a moment where the term prison industrial complex, or at least prison and police abolition, is making its way onto many more people's tongues than ever before, than certainly, you know, over the last year, ever since the renewed uprisings that occurred, starting in Minneapolis after George Floyd was murdered, leading to what some people have said is perhaps the largest protest movement in United States history, that occurred during a pandemic, and huge economic dislocation, all of which I think contributed to that protest. The cries in the streets that people were making that were not about reformist reforms, but were actually about defunding the police, something that I think is still reverberating across the country, discomfiting people, making so many people so just kind of uncomfortable, to the point where we have the Democratic Party right after they win taking to the airwaves, sending Jim Clyburn and Barack Obama and all these other people out to the airwaves to talk about why we shouldn't defund the police. That tells you everything you need to know about social movements and our ability to do agenda setting well, and forcing people to respond to us as opposed to us running in a reactionary way to respond to them. So my book, as you mentioned, We Do This Till We Free Us, Abolitionist Organizing and Transforming Justice, is coming out on February 23rd. So a few days before you'll be seeing this particular event, or gathering or conversation. And my book is a collaboration in the way that most of everything that I do is. It includes essays that I've written and essays that I've co-written with others who are comrades and co-organizers. It includes talks, some excerpts from talks that I've given, and it includes some interviews that I've given to folks, mostly on podcasts. The book is published by Haymarket. It's edited by Tamara Knopper, and it is part of a series that is being fostered and facilitated by Naomi Murakawa, called The Abolitionist Papers. And I've been asked for many years to write a book, and I don't like writing. I hate writing, actually. Which for some people is surprising, considering I write a lot. I make a lot of zines. I make a lot of kind of, resource tools. I make a lot of curricula. I write in different ways, sometimes public ways, sometimes academic ways, but I hate it. And one of the things I was asked and have been asked is, will you publish a book? And I always say, well, I've published many books, they just have been sometimes self-published. I published a children's book. I, do other things, but this is kind of, finally, I agreed this summer to do this project. So this is a really quick turnaround for a publisher to get something out this quickly. And I mainly agreed because Tamara was going to be involved, and I have great respect for her. And as I mentioned to open, we were in this moment where abolition was on a lot of people's tongues. And I was hoping that this book would be a door for folks to begin thinking about abolition in its fullness, and wanting maybe to do more work around learning more about it moving forward. And I tie this to Prisoners Inventions because abolition, PAC abolition, is rooted in the Black radical tradition, but it's also rooted deeply in the experiences and the lives and the intellectual work of incarcerated people and criminalized people. It is rooted in the thoughts and intellectual offerings of people like George Jackson and Angela Davis, both of whom were incarcerated themselves. It is rooted in the kind of lived experiences of the Attica brothers. It is rooted in so much of what we understand to be the carceral state and the people most impacted by it. So my organizing over the last few years has really been centered on an abolitionist framework. I started really kind of rooting myself within abolition in the late 90s, the early 2000s. And I've been trying to make sense of it ever since. So let me move forward in a slide to help people get a general sense of what is the prison industrial complex, right? That it exists to control, contain, and eliminate particular groups, but everyone's actually impacted. So that's one of the axioms that I think people should keep in mind and what my book tries to say. So these are going to be like 15 axioms that are rooted in the book that I hope will help explain what I mean by prison industrial complex abolition. Since the late 1970s in the US, criminalization really has been the primary way to deal with social problems produced by racial capitalism. And in particular, criminalization orders Black life in the United States. This doesn't mean that only Black people are impacted, of course not. It just means that disproportionately Black people are targeted, and it means disproportionately Indigenous people are targeted, and it's, you know, disproportionately Latinx people are targeted. But there are plenty of white people locked up in prison, and so we have to constantly be making sure that we understand the full concept of this. PIC abolition is necessarily anti-racist and anti-oppressive, so it is, you know, squarely challenging white supremacy, sexism, ableism, transphobia, and so much more. Dismantling capitalism is central to the PIC abolitionist project, that you can't imagine an end of police and policing without imagining an end of private property and expropriation by the capitalist class. Like, these things have to also go before we can actually, I think, eliminate police and policing, because under capitalism, they are absolutely necessary to the maintenance of the systems that we're trying to uproot in PIC abolitionist project thought. PIC abolition is anti-imperialist, it's internationalist and global. And I think this is really important because people often have a US-centric view, but prisons are everywhere. Police are everywhere. Surveillance is increasingly everywhere. These things we have to look at broadly, and we know how much of this technologies of incarceration the US actually exports to other places. And you know, our private prisons are not growing as much in the US now. They're growing in South Africa and in Brazil and in other places. So they're looking for new markets, and that we have to be conscious of that. PIC abolition has to be feminist, and feminism has to be abolitionist. This is a point that I make in the book, and there's more there. So if you want to learn about that, you can take a look at the book. I think this is an important point that I want to just stay on for a second. There's you know, people who have very little conception of prison industrial complex abolition often accuse abolitionists of not caring about violence and not caring about harm, which I find so interesting, because the reason I became a prison industrial, like the reason I came to prison industrial abolition as a vision, as a politic, and as a practical organizing strategy is precisely because the unit of concern that I've had is violence and harm. Both as somebody who survived violence and harm, but also as somebody who has harmed other people. And again, it's just a matter of degree rather than this binary of people who harm and people who are harmed. That's a binary that prison industrial complex always focuses on exploding, because it's not that simple. We're all messy. And again, it's a matter of degree. Some people cause great harm and some people just cause, relatively minor harms, but we all harm. Some people experience great harm and some people, experience relatively minor harm. It's just a matter of degree. So abolitionists are concerned with ending sources of violence, period. And that we know that prisons don't solve violence, that in fact, prisons are the most concentrated violence that exists, and that they're designed to facilitate premature death. And that if you're somebody who is supposedly anti-violence, then how are you going to support prisons and policing and surveillance, which are all inherently violent institutions and violent tools of control, containment, and elimination, right? Like, it just doesn't make sense. It doesn't compute. And that is something that PAC abolitionists mention and share with folks regularly. Ultimately, very important to point this out, that PAC abolitionists are laying out a principle that is based on a belief and a hypothesis that people can and do change. That people aren't just frozen in the worst things they've done, that there's a possibility for transformation, and that we owe it to ourselves to make sure and help people to change and to transform. And for those who don't want to do that, which is always the question that comes up, then we have to figure out new ways of making sure that they don't harm people in the ways they have and don't continue to harm people in new ways. And we don't think that includes prisons, just a fact, right? PAC abolition really seeks to eliminate prisons, policing, and surveillance. And you can see that I didn't start here, because I think that people don't understand that PAC abolition is both a project of dismantling, but it's also very critically one of building. That while we're dismantling a system that has to go, we're also trying to build new social relations. We're also trying to build healthier ways for us to interact with each other. And we're also trying to build institutions that actually contribute to people's safety and wellness. That's critically important to PAC abolition. The vision of prison industrial complex abolition is not our current society minus police, prisons, and surveillance. I think this is really important, because folks see this and they're just like, oh, you're saying we got to get rid of prisons, policing, and surveillance, and the current society we live in is the one that's going to remain? Like, right? And we're saying PAC abolition is actually a vision of a restructured society and world. It's a vision where, in a world where we have everything that we need. And that includes food and shelter and education and health and art and beauty and clean water and more. And if you understand that to be the case, that it's a vision of a restructured society, then no, it isn't a vision of our current society minus these three institutions of death making. We have to transform everything in order for us to be able to get to the horizon, to reach that horizon, and then to have new problems emerge at that horizon. This is Ruth Wilson Gilmore, one of the kind of intellectual and organizational inspirations of PAC abolitionists and abolition itself. And Dr. Ruthie always says that PAC abolition is work people already do. And this is really important, because it's not like something is happening out there in a utopic world, but it's like the day-to-day practices that we put in place that are abolitionist steps towards getting us to where we want to go. So it's not, like out there that we can't conceive of in a real way. It requires imagination. I think you all who may be watching this, who maybe feel, are part of art, making art in some way, understand the importance of imagination. And I always say this because it's true, inspired by something that Alice Walker always used to say, which was that oppression puts our ceiling on our brains. And I adapted that to saying that oppression puts a ceiling on our imaginations. And what art does is to help lift the ceiling off our imaginations, uh, foster that, and help us to actually think of new ways, different things that we haven't seen before. So we have to invent new worlds and new ways of being with each other. And we have to prefigure the world in which we want to live every day. So everybody asks, what's the alternative then to prison? And that's the wrong question. Sorry to tell you that. Because there isn't one alternative to or replacement for prison. There have to be 1,000 different experiments. We have to work in multiple different ways to be able to address that. And this is important because part of what prisons, why they're just complete and utter, quote, failures, even though I don't like to use that term because, you know, they work very well at targeting the people that they actually want to target. But the reason why, quote, prisons do work but don't work is that it's a one size fits all. And if you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And harms are really different and they call for different responses. And that's part of the issue, is that PAC abolitionists were very interested in that. And so that means that there can't be, it's not a one-to-one, you know? Here are prisons, let's replace it with one other thing. This doesn't make sense. So that's something that my book talks about. And this concept of we'll figure it out by working to get there is actually praxis and not evasion. And what I mean by that is, like, people say, well, how is this going to happen? And my answer is, we'll figure it out by working to get there. This is connected to Ruthie Gilmore's point that abolition is work that people already do. I'm going to end soon with one last thought, but there are clear principles about not looking to prison system or to the police for solutions. That's a critical tenet of PAC abolition, but we're going to work it out. We're going to figure it out because ultimately abolition is a collective project, not an individual one. So PAC abolition last is rooted in different political traditions, but emerges, as I mentioned at the beginning, out of the lived experiences and organizing of incarcerated and criminalized people. And it's with this that I want to come back to having a conversation about Prisoners Inventions with Marc and Brett, and bringing up some of the issues that this raises for me in my work and in my thinking around abolition. I hope that those of you who are interested in these axioms will pick up the book, read it, share it with other people. Yeah, there we go.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thanks,
Yeah,
Mariame.
of course.
Yeah, I think, like, as we were working on this, I mean, there was just, like, it didn't really feel like there were useful models for how to do what we were trying to do. Like, how do you have how to have those relationships, or how to work across such totally different realities, even just like the speed of communicating, you know, with each other constantly over the internet and in person and over the phone, and then having to send a letter that might take an extra week to get through the mailroom and then has to be responded to, you know, on Angelo's time, and someone with an extremely different sense of time, and not really any obvious kind of guidance of like how to resolve conflicts or how to have that kind of friendship even. And also just the idea of a kind of lifelong commitment to a person through their whole experience of incarceration, like, you know, which in this case was decades until, like, fortunately their release, but also what happens then, right? Like, what happens when you can have a relationship that's not the one that you had, and how that works. And yeah, there aren't, it didn't feel like there was ever like a textbook for how to do this, you know?
Mm-hmm. Yep. But I think that speaks to what we were talking about before, that at its bottom, I think at least the way I think about things as it relates particularly to PAC abolition is that our work is to work with incarcerated people and to build relationships with them that are authentic and that are that teach us, but also that they learn from us, that it's a reciprocal relationship, you know? And I think what you've both been able to kind of bring forward is just how rich that can be in terms of collaboration and in terms of sharing things with other people and helping them to learn more about the prison and how the prison works to basically crush people and break people, that people could in a way witness it through the artifact that was made is, to me, again, something so important.
Yeah, Prisoners Inventions, like just it short circuits the sort of the really stupid discussion in our society around prisons and the need for prisons and how you treat people who are in prisons. It just short circuits so many things around how you if you don't have any connection to a prisoner or have not been in a prison, it just short circuits like the understanding and the ways in which you're kind of conditioned to think about folks. And when you have no idea what they're going through, no idea what daily life is like, no idea about just how absolutely miserable these places are, and how little hope they give, or how hope or help they give in sort of doing what they're supposed to, but they're not really supposed to fix people, especially in the way that they're configured. And I really appreciate your insistence on a working process and and correcting that, adjusting it, and continuing to move forward. Also want to say and put this out there for folks listening to also check out your op-ed in the New York Times. Absolutely fantastic title. I'm not sure if I'm going to get it right. It's was it something along the lines of, yes, we really do mean to fund the police.
Yeah.
I picked it up. It's like, oh shit, this is awesome. But it's fantastic that you, we really enjoy working with you, Mariame, and I just want to sort of get you to reflect a little bit more on the work you're doing with artists and people who visualize things and people who figure out how to break down normal ways of approaching things and opening up new directions. You're doing this with your writing. It's so clear, it's so direct, it's disarming. If you're an honest person, if you're a dishonest person and you're not really thinking through these things, you're going to have this knee-jerk reaction, but it really breaks things down. And it breaks, yeah, it'd be great to hear you reflect a little bit on that.
I appreciate
the writing you hate doing.
Yes, the writing I hate doing, but the collaborations I love doing, you know, and collaborating with both of you has been joyful in the couple of times that we've gotten to do it. And I think a lot about, for myself, that because I mentioned imagination in my remarks as it relates to PAC abolition, that creativity and art is essential to this project that we are embarked on, which is a project that is going to exceed my lifetime, but that needs to have different types of grammars and different types of ways for people to access the ideas that often feel super radical to them until you see a kind of visual representation of possibility that may give you a different angle. And I think that to me is so important. I was thinking about, when it comes to the book, to Prisoners Inventions, something that I wonder if people who read it are thinking about, like it forces you, I think, and this is my opinion, it forces you, I think, to consider the conditions under which the art was produced. Like, you're not going to be able to look at these drawings and not think about the conditions that led to them. I think that's something hard to do with writing, to be honest. like just writing. I think you need the visual art part to help move people from the analytic, I'm just trying to get this in my brain, my head, to like the connection to a heart issue that allows us to be able to kind of explode the natural distancing, which is not us and somewhere out there, which is so toxic and helps to keep the PIC in place when it's somewhere else and not me. And so, yeah, so I think a little bit about that is what comes to mind as to why I feel very strongly about collaborating with artists, particularly visual artists, in the projects and processes that I make. And so this book kind of falls in that line for me.
There's this thing, I think we didn't mention this in the book, but one of, I think, the really interesting aspects of drawing for Angelo is that drawings, I guess, are technically classified as documents rather than art. And it's entirely because he did everything in ballpoint pen on paper and wasn't trying to make paintings about this, that he could even mail it out, right? That he didn't have to be enrolled in a hobby program or something in order to get permission from the prison to send things out, even though they wouldn't have let them back in because they would have looked at them more closely. But yeah, I think for a lot of people, if a lot of people were asked, what is an example of ways people in prison might want to put their ingenuity to use while they're incarcerated, I imagine they probably wouldn't say, well, they want to try to figure out how to make a pizza, or like how to like not have dirt come in through the bottom of their cell, or like stop a really miserable draft from coming into their cell using newspapers and socks. And I think, I don't think Angelo was discarding hundreds of terrible things people invent to hurt each other. I think this is really like what he saw and what he felt, actually tells like the real story of incarceration of prison as he experienced it, which was a lot of like trying to feel human,
Yes, I was going to say that. I was going to say the reclaiming of humanity is so important and so visible in the book, right? The reclaiming of humanity through depicting the mundane.
Yeah.
And I think that's something people don't understand in prison. It's like prison is just a lot of time and a lot of boredom for a lot of people. Like people constantly, my family members, are extremely, because most prisoners don't work, right? Like that's actually, your days are interminable. And I think about that a lot, about like how not to lose yourself in that. And I feel like the book shares that part about the kind of the time and the boringness or the routineness or the mundaneness of everything, which is why it makes sense to, talk about making pizza. Like that's just life,
Yeah, I mean, all of the experience of, jobs before prison where you repaired things or cooking for yourself, someone who fixed cars or fixed toilets, like, or anything, where they had to use their hands, like who would want to abandon that, in those circumstances. So I think it does, I think, show people the just basic human desire to return to the satisfaction of having the ability to like make or fix or transform anything material. That's just a real fundamental aspect of being human.
Or even things like having privacy. I mean, some of the most amazing things with the privacy curtains. You have your toilet right there by at least one person's bunk, so you have this toilet and you're in there. Often if you're locked down, you have to, like, there's no privacy. These most intimate things that we take for granted having privacy for just sort of disappeared. There's so many things that these inventions try to reclaim some sort of dignity, or I mean, don't even come close, but it's in that trying, and it's in some of the inventions that come out, like homemade prophylactics, for example, like the state of California not giving out condoms and pretending like this is going to keep people from having sex. It's deeply irresponsible. Criminal relationship to human sexuality, and what happens to people when they're put in cages. So things like this come through too, and it's so many of these inventions covering all these aspects of being a person, and sort of all these things we take for granted, those of us who are not currently incarcerated. It builds the drawings, and coming back to what you were saying, Mariame, this like empathy that it triggers is just really strong. We often talked about, Marc, Salem, and I, about how through doing this work, like where were we as artists in this? Like we felt really like we were just kind of holding the space, sort of channeling, letting the space open for all this other creativity and all this other stuff to just channel through. And it really felt like that we were just kind of in the back, kind of, we're the stage builders for all this stuff to kind of like flourish and come forward, because it needed to find people to share this message.
Yeah, a number of people. I'm sorry, Mariame, go ahead.
No, one last thing that I had in mind was that when the how do you call it? My point about prisons basically fostering premature death. The antithesis of that, in a way, for me, is this book, which is about kind of fostering livingness. Like this is the living part of being incarcerated, the very specific kinds of inventions that are needed for living. And I just think that is so critically important. And again, that's why having a wall socket lighter and candles and a dice table for like playing and having some form of distraction around pleasure, like that, those things in here is a counter to the premature death making of the institution. And I just think, as people pick it up and look through it, maybe that'll be something that comes through as well, and is so needed, because the stories of like the harrowing part of things sometimes people tune out, and they're just not wanting to engage because it feels too awful, but it also said, like, what are you doing about it? Right. Yeah, sorry, go ahead, Marc.
Yeah, there've been some interesting. There's some people who use the book. We've become aware over time, like in teaching things like subjects like design, because I think it gets to the real heart of the limitations of materials, or how to push the limitations of materials. And I think it does sensitize people to their privilege, and also I think to just these kind of like core qualities of or what it means to use tools to make things, and having access to those tools. Something along those lines. I got lost somewhere along the lines there. It's okay.
I think we are supposed to be closing soon, but I
right.
would be remiss if we didn't bring up an issue that I know we all have thought about in multiple kinds of ways, and with a recent controversy kind of reemergence, which is the question of when you are collaborating with incarcerated and formerly incarcerated people, do you ask them what they were convicted of? And if you don't, Brett brought this up earlier, if you don't, why not? And if you do, why? If each of you have some thoughts on that, I'd be happy to share mine too.
Yeah, I mean, Brett and I both have done some work inside prisons. With Angelo, everything was through correspondence. When I was in college, I was a volunteer visiting artist at Western Penitentiary in Pittsburgh, which has since been torn down. and there was a waiver I had to sign about, whether there were people with certain kinds of convictions that I wouldn't work with. And I said that it wasn't important to me to know, what my students or the people I'd be working with, why they were in prison. To me, what was more important was how they treated me, what my experience of working with them was like, which could be not good or really wonderful, irregardless of what they may have done to be in prison. And I was curious, not why they were in prison, but if maybe there was a chance they were going to get out, because then we could start thinking about maybe how they could be artists outside of prison, or if they were never getting out, if they felt confident that that was not going to happen, and then maybe we could think about how their art could be a rewarding thing for them, given the limitations of being in prison. We worked with Angelo without an understanding of why he was in prison. That was something for me that I didn't learn until much, much later. Yeah, it really, when we were working on the project, we were thinking a lot about how he was telling the stories of wasn't just his story. He was, almost like a kind of, he was like a documentarian of things he had seen many, many people doing. And I think we all thought that, he was contributing something important to a larger understanding of the prison experience that could help people on the outside and would be meaningful for people who had that experience.
And part of our way of working within temporary services since the very beginning was to work as a group, to have discussions, to find consensus, to treat each other with as much dignity and respect as possible, and to give space for different opinions, different ideas. And this was something we fully offered to Angelo, and created this space to just treat him as a person. Certainly wasn't getting this frequently or regularly, being incarcerated. And so we just offered him the dignity of like being nice to him, working with him, collaborating with him. This is what people are craving. If you've been in a prison, you know that people are craving this like basic dignity and kindness. That was something we wanted to maintain. I think we talked about this before we started recording, is that there's this sort of constant habit of people who are not sensitized and familiar with prisons and a lot of the issues we've been talking about, to treat people as if they're committing their crime at this very second, and then they keep doing it over and over again, and to not really see their humanity as a place for understanding a lot more about them. And so if we had just treated Angelo in this way, and we never did ask him. I don't remember asking anybody I worked with in the place where I taught, like why they were there. If they wanted to offer it to me, that was fine, but it didn't change how I reacted and related to people. Tried to create this space of respect as a starting point for potential collaboration and work together.
There's also, there's this really, dominant generalization and stereotype that, well, people in prison, they're going to con you, like eventually you're going to get scammed. Like you should live for decades waiting for the other shoe to drop, and like the scam to arrive. And like, sometimes it doesn't arrive. Like Angela didn't ask for anything from us, like we gave things to him, like, but he wasn't like constantly, he would ask for really crazy things like, stamps so he could mail us more drawings, or envelopes or something. Like he was incredibly generous, like really kind, pleasant person to work with. Like it was a great collaboration, and I think there's this attitude like eventually you're going to be victimized, by your pen pal of 25 years or something, and you deal with people like as based on like how they treat you, and like just what like wasn't our experience.
I think a lot about this all the time, because I think like I don't shy away from the fact that many people who are in prison have done incredibly harmful things,
Yeah.
and also experienced incredibly harmful things. Like both things are usually true. And I think we have to kind of be really clear, at least for me as a PAC abolitionist, who is concerned with the sources of violence wherever they are, that we're always having conversations about violence, and we should be working towards eradicating violence, period, across the board, and that includes the violence in prisons, policing, and surveillance. Like those things are included in that. And so I don't shy away from harm. In fact, that's why I'm engaged in lots of transformative justice processes and trying to directly name when harm occurs and trying to think of different ways for us to create new relations with each other. Like that's part of my work, and not work that I get paid to do, work of community, right? Like, so I think that that's really important. And I do want to say that, are we going to ask every single person we work with all the time whether they've ever been incarcerated or criminalized? Like, is that going to be a thing where there's like, for every possibility of every collaboration we're ever going to have, we're going to background check everyone now? Like, what is the line? No, it's really real. Like, what is right?
It's
like
great.
what?
It's a great question.
And also, like, then if you were in for like property crime, that's okay. But if you killed somebody, no. Like, who determines that? Is it you as an individual that determines that? Can only the direct people whose family was directly harmed be the ones who say no? Like, how do we even make that work in the world? I think we have to uplift people who survived harm. Okay, that's just like a basic fact. We have to believe them when they tell us that they've been harmed. We've got to look for ways to repair that harm if it's possible. Maybe not, we won't be able to do it perfectly and for everyone, but we've got to take that and center that. We have to make structural changes so people who've survived harm get the resources they need to heal. Like, we have to do all of that work, and that is not kind of like an either or situation that then means that everybody who's been incarcerated or criminalized now has to divulge what they did. Like, we can be doing both things at once, which is a bedrock principle of abolition, is that we're not asking people what crime they committed, because that's not the only thing they are. And it's also none of my fucking business. Like, can I just say that, right? It's not. And yeah, and I just wanted to kind of put that out there, because I'm pretty sure people who might be watching this, who are affiliated with the printed matter community and family, are experiencing this in their collaborations that they may be having with people who are incarcerated, and maybe even struggling with the tensions that this raises when it turns out that somebody you were working with committed a horrific crime, and then everybody is asking you to denounce them, and everybody's asking you to deplatform them, and everybody's asking you what the hell you were thinking that you didn't ask, right? Like, we have to figure out ways of, we have 2.3 million people locked up currently in jails and prisons in the United States. 1 out of 2 Black women has an incarcerated person in their lives. Like, 1 out of 2 of us love somebody who's been incarcerated or is currently incarcerated. Like, this is massive. This is all around our culture. And the last thing I want to say on this point that I think is super important is that, do you know what background checks do? They tell you about who was caught.
Right.
And if we have a system we all agree is racist, classist, all this, and that's the system that's determining who got caught, that's a tiny fraction, by the way, of people who've committed harm who ever get convicted and go to prison. So that means we got a whole bunch of people with no records who caused great harm out there roaming. What are we going to do about them if we're working with them or collaborating with them or what? Like, what's the quote identification system for them? Like, I just think it's really, we have to really be honest with ourselves about what all of this means. And often we get told that we don't care about people who survived violence, as though
most of the people who are incarcerated have not been survivors of violence. They are, and they're survivors of current violence. And as though the people who are working with folks aren't survivors of violence themselves. Like, you know, this is where we get all murky. So I just wanted to raise that because I'm sure that people think about this in their own work. Printed matter, by the way, you can cut this part out if it feels like a rant to you.
No.
They
This
have
is
to
what we're
leave it.
waiting for.
This is why we wanted to talk to you. I'm constantly amazed at where you're popping up and the things that I'm looking at. Oh, it's like, oh, there's Mariame. She's talking over here. There's Mariame. She's talking over here. What you're saying is incredibly necessary, incredibly important. This impetus to transform our entire society is critical. You know, we're in the middle of this pandemic. Prison's one thing, but you know, we have 30 million people who don't have enough food to eat in the middle of a pandemic.
Yep.
This system doesn't fucking work. This, like, our society is broken in so many different ways. So this systemic questioning and this fearlessness you have, like, keep bringing it. Thank you.
Thank you so much to everyone who watched this. You know, feel free to reach out to us through halfletterpress.com, publishers at halfletterpress.com is our email. I really hope that we can all sweat together at the art book fair in the coming years. You know, it's just not the same without the you know, incredible density of social overwhelm.
I think those fairs are going to have to be masked fairs from now on. That's going to be maybe a legacy of the pandemic. I don't know. Life isn't going to be exactly the same.
No. Keep you know, helping us help the U.S. Postal Service. Seek out Mariame's book through Haymarket. You're also doing
I can't wait to see
really
it.
wonderful work in Chicago. So
All
okay.
right. Thank you.
Thank you.